you have your camera on, it'll be just the PowerPoints that go on the home study. So even if you don't have your camera off, that's totally fine. I will also ask on that bottom control panel that everybody mutes themselves for the majority of the lecture. If you have any questions, please unmute yourself and ask, or you can use the lovely chat feature that's in the upper right corner. It looks like a little chat box. I don't know how else to describe that. I'm going to be posting the links to the course evaluation, which is optional, and the course assessment, which will get you your statement of credit. Your statement of credit will be emailed to you by Certifium, not by me. Okay, so it'll be a different email address that it's coming from. If you take the quiz and don't see the email within an hour or so, check your spam folder. Sometimes they show up there. If you still don't get it, then maybe you didn't pass the quiz. You need 80% to pass and get the certificate. But the good news is you can take the test as many times as you need to. It shouldn't be that hard. We tried not to make it challenging, but the links for those will be in the chat. And I think that's all I have for right now. Like I said, if anybody has questions, feel free to ask at any time. We love having conversations, having some discourse, even especially since it's a webinar and we can't be face-to-face with each other. Our first speaker today is Dr. Tom Buckley. Dr. Buckley is an associate professor of athletic training in the Department of Kinesiology and Applied Physiology at the University of Delaware, where he conducts concussion-related research and co-directs the university's involvement in the NCAA DoD Grand Alliance Care Consortium. Dr. Buckley has a Bachelor of Science in Athletic Training from Springfield College, a Master of Science in Athletic Training from Indiana State University, and a doctorate in Applied Physiology from Columbia University Teachers College. Dr. Buckley has over 100 peer-reviewed publications and has been awarded over $2 million in research funding from the National Institute of Health, Neurological Disorders, Department of Defense, Office of Naval Research, Army Research Office, NCAA, and the State of Delaware Economic Development Office. You can find him on Twitter at ConcussionUD. Without further ado, here's Dr. Buckley.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Someone give me a thumbs up. Thank you, Dr. Howell. Yes, I'm sitting outside. It's actually the strongest Wi-Fi place in the house. I don't know why. But as the least chance of it going down, I probably just cursed myself. So I'm going to start here. So as I go through this, I can't see the chat function. So if anything is, if there's any questions, please just feel free to speak up, and I will go through there. And so again, I'm Dr. Buckley, Tom Buckley from the University of Delaware. No financial conflicts of interest associated with anything in this presentation today. This is the location of research funding, as was mentioned. Nothing here again is a conflict. I do point out at the bottom here, Applied Cognitive Engineering. This was a private contract, but nothing in this lecture today, today's presentation, has anything to do with what the work I did for that company. So everything here should be free from conflict. I'm going to look at age of first exposure. Really here, this is obviously a topic that gets a lot of discussion right now. Age of first exposure to football. What's the long-term outcomes on this? What's the outcome specific to CTE? That's obviously the one we get a lot about discussed. What's the long-term outcomes just of playing football? So independent of age of first exposure, just is playing football dangerous? And then our more recent work that we've done a lot of work on is the short-term issue here. What's the issue of age of first exposure when you're still young? And are you setting yourself up for long-term problems while you're still young? So is football safe? You know, it's interesting, Megan, you know, she gave my Twitter address there. You know, I think this picture kind of summarizes the current Twitterverse. We'd like to have a rational discussion about this, but if you go on Twitter, you either hate America or hate children, depending on which side of this issue you come down on. There's no black and white. Unfortunately, we see this across a number of discussions online nowadays. I'm going to try and present a rational discussion. You guys can decide if I do or not. And I'm going to try to avoid our social media craziness here, try to give a balanced approach to this here. But we have discussions like this, where we have the actual term child abuse, which is obviously an extraordinarily serious allegation and charge and event, being tied to youth football. Is this in the rational, fair-minded perspective? Probably not, I would suggest. Taking a step back historically, it's interesting. We've obviously had a lot of discussion now on with COVID, with the Spanish flu of 1918, how the more things change, the more they don't. You can kind of almost see the same about football here. So in 1905, over 100 years ago, President Roosevelt actually had a meeting of the primary football powerhouses, which at that time was Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and the University of Chicago. Not exactly the same schools that are top 5 in the FCS nowadays. But there was 18 football deaths in 1905 alone. Can you imagine if they had Twitter during that? 18 football deaths and 45 deaths over a five season period. Coming out of this meeting with President Roosevelt, they actually stepped back and they made a lot of rule changes that helped reduce the violence. In the 1905 season, there were 19 concussions in the Harvard football team. And one of the things that came out of this, one of the phrases they had was the constant attendance of 2 trained surgeons is required at a football game. It is not a luxury. And this is not solely for head injury, obviously, but this was part of the overall discussion. JAMA article in 1906. At the present time, no one is ready to say whether a concussion of the brain may or may not have serious consequences in life. 114 years later, I don't think we've improved that much on this discussion. It's interesting in this 1905 one, to back to the COVID discussion, in 1918, during the Spanish flu, Harvard actually did maintain a football season, but they only played 3 games. And you can find pictures, they did wear masks during the games. So again, 100 plus years later, things don't always change that much. 2014, President Obama had a meeting at the White House regarding safety of football. Wanted to take home quotes, keep them safe, better information. And then you get a lot of press for, I wouldn't let my son play football. If you're a football fan, you might know a player named Tony Baselli, was a big offensive lineman for a long time. He responded to this by saying, I wouldn't let my son play politics. Football is safer. And as you look at the President Obama's comment and the current President Trump had the opposite opinion, probably not a lot of surprise here, suggesting that it's ruining the game of football. So what does this really come down to? When we start to look at, is it concussions? Probably not. Most of the literature I'm going to show you today is on this topic of repetitive head impacts. You may hear this referred to as subconcussive blows a lot of times in the literature. My personal preference is the term repetitive head impact simply because it refers to being hit in the head. It doesn't necessarily imply a pathology taking place. All right, think of it as concussion and brain trauma as acceleration to the head. We have that with sneezing. We have that on roller coasters. And I don't think we're going to call sneezing brain damage. So I think repetitive head impacts is a term I think you're seeing more of right now. And so this figure right here on the right is the one I like a lot. I think the idea is there a dose response? Getting hit in the head once, not going to be a problem for anyone's life, right? Getting hit in the head 1,000 times, 10,000 times, 100,000 times. At what point do problems really start to occur? And do we see this dose response? And so what you see on this graph is at some point here, everyone kind of has this baseline risk of a long-term negative outcome. People will get Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and yes, CTE and dementia and other issues without playing football, without repetitive head impacts. There's some risk that all of us, any of us, could experience one of these neurological disorders. But once we pass some threshold, represent this dotted line right here, once we pass this, we then go to a place where now this risk rate elevates. And so the more we play, the more we get hit in the head, the greater our chance is. So this is kind of the theory right here that's being postulated. You see in that bottom left corner, a lot of this work comes from the Boston University Center for CTE and the work they've done. It really has brought this to the forefront. So, is this again tied to cognitive issues, executive dysfunction, depression, apathy, and behavior dysregulation? And is it occurring past what this threshold is? So I think, the first question jump to mind is, what's our baseline risk? We have a general idea of that from the overall general population. What's the risk of Alzheimer's? What's the risk of Parkinson's? When does that risk go up? What role does aging play in it? But then what is really the dose response here? What's this threshold whereby once we pass this rate starts to go up, all right? And so this is one study that came out of BU that attempts to address that issue. And they created this threshold right here. And the average number, CHHI, is a terminology they came up with for cumulative head impact index, and how many impacts you need to have in order to have to cross that threshold for each of these domains. And you see they range from about 1,800 impacts up to about 7,200 impacts. And they're there. So, well, I present this because you look at high school sports. So high school football, I'll talk about college and NFL later on, but just high school football, which is where most of your kids are, high school and below, you're seeing that depending on the position they play, someplace between 300 and 800 impacts per season is kind of the norm that you would expect to see. But you multiply it out times 4 seasons, you would be at someplace between 1,400 and 3,400 impacts, which could put you over the dose response in 5 to 6 categories. You see that cognition's really got a very high dose response number right there. So if this threshold theory holds, your risk would start to go up following 4 years of high school football. I think that's when you look at the public health side of this, that's kind of what we're getting at there. All right, so the age of first exposure. So when you start young, if you start young, is this worse? This gets a lot of attention. This is only a 5-year-old discussion. This study that really came out the start of this was 2015. That's 2 days before Super Bowl 49. And I saw a lot of email addresses signed up here, a lot of Massachusetts. So this is the study right here. I remember which one Super Bowl 49 was. Patriots win so many, it's hard to remember sometimes. But this one's on here specifically for Dr. Howell. But this, keep an eye on 21 right here. He kind of makes a big play. This was the first study on this that came out that really got a lot of attention, got a lot of focus, and given the timing of it, got a lot of attention worldwide. U.S. News and World Report, ESPN, all over media discussion came up on this. So what did that say? So look at age of first exposure, looking at the age of 12, above and below the age of 12. And later life outcomes. Now, it's worth noting these are all former NFL football players. They're in their 50s, as you see right here. And it's a relatively small study. Only 42 people were involved. Sorry, my phone's going off here, trying to get it to be quiet. Learning disabilities, relatively low in both groups, a little bit higher in the age of first exposure, below 12 group. They started playing around the age of 9. The over 12 group started playing around the age of 14. They played a little bit longer, that younger group did. But this is a statistic that really jumps out. If you read research, it's really easy to kind of skip the methods, demographics. That's really boring, age, height, weight, etc. Look at those number of concussions. This is self-report. I'll get to the actual method in a second. 392 is the mean number of concussions, average number of concussions in the group, versus 370 in the over 12 group. All right, so how did they get to this number? Because I think on the surface, that strikes most people as ridiculous. Especially about a lot of concussions in the past where 3 or more concussions might be an issue. 392 is a problematic number, to say the least. Well, they were given a modern definition of concussion. That's what C means, which comes from Ohio State TBI instrument. But even in the literature they cite on it, they say this: when you give this modern definition, it basically doubles what you would expect. And so without a modern definition, they would estimate about 200 or so concussions. Again, this is a pretty significant number when we talk about where we are in this study, and what they found is that close to 400 concussions were being experienced by these individuals. So what they find here, on the left-hand side here, these are a wide range of cognitive outcome measures. And we see in about half of them, about 3/4 of them, those who started playing football before the age of 12 did worse than the group that started playing after the age of 12. And so that's problematic, right? 6 out of 9, 2/3 did worse when they're in their early 50s. I want to single in on one right here. It's called the WERAT. It's a very, very well-known cognitive assessment, been used for a long time and well-established. And so again, you see there's about 8-point difference between two groups right here, a little over 8 points, really significant. But what does this mean? Okay, and this is sometimes we miss in some of this discussion is, where is it? Well, the average score in the WERAT's 100. And then the standard deviation is about 10. So the average here, if you're between 90 and about 109, you're basically normal. And so you see this group here that did do worse, no question, is still in the normal range. And then there's age adjustments and some things along these lines need to go into this discussion. So actually do a little better than that. But both groups are normal, but those that started younger did worse. And so I think, sometimes we look at saying, okay, we're worse, yes, but is worse bad? And in this case, worse is average. On the low end of average, without question, but average. And so again, a series of these right here, when you adjust for age and duration of football play, they're all different. Again, suggesting that the people who started younger, regardless of their age when tested or how long they played football, did worse across the board on these cognitive tests. So certainly evidence right now, small study, but certainly evidence that people who start playing younger did do worse on cognitive outcomes. Clear association between participation in TAF football prior to age 12 and later life cognitive impairments using objective neuropsych testing. So coming up on this, really kind of drives the question, is it age of first exposure or is it duration of play? How long do you play? Same group right here, the names change a little bit, but it's the same group that did this study here. In this case, they defined duration of play as a total number of years of organized American football. Now I'm a Patriots fan from the Boston area, so I can't pass this up. I don't really know if playing for the Jets counts as organized football or not, but different story, different day. What we're really looking at here for organized football is youth football. So as you work your way through, there's an odds ratio of 1. Again, everyone has a risk of disease. And so the key findings of the study was the odds of CTE increased by about 30% with every year of play. That was a big headline when this story study came out about a year and a half ago now. This is a big story that came out of it. The odds doubled every 2.5 years. And the odds increased by tenfold every 9 years of football experience. Those are pretty stark findings. And they had a threshold here, maybe about 11 years of play, where your odds really started to go up. So when you look at these numbers, this is very concerning. But there's a couple caveats you need to keep in mind right here. Number one, and this is their quote, not mine, from BU, brain donation registries are not representative of the general public. The people who were in this study, they're all deceased. Remember, the only way you can diagnose CTE is postmortem. There's no current test that can identify CTE in a living person. There are websites called, I think it's Living with CTE. There are people who claim to have diagnosed CTE among the living. Right now, the consensus is CTE only diagnosed postmortem. And so these are all former football players who had neuropathological problems in later life. They had depression, they had anxiety, they had cognitive decline. They self-enrolled in this brain donation registry. And so we don't know what the rest of the people are. And so that's an important caveat. But the other really important caveat is you look at all these numbers, they look kind of scary. We don't know what the base rate is. All right, so an increase of 30% from what? From 1%, from 0.1%, from 10%? We don't know what that base rate is. And so without knowing if that's 1% or 50%, it's hard to say. Again, it doubles every 2.5 years. If your base rate's 10%, then it's 20% for 2.5 years. If your base rate's 0.1%, it's now 0.2% for 2.5 years. So that question of the base rate is really, we don't know right now. We have no good ideas what that number actually is. So neuroimaging, there's been a lot of positive outcomes on this. We see that the age of first exposure, the earlier you start playing, the smaller your right thalamus is. We see increased duration of plays. This is the total number of years played down here on the bottom left. The longer you play, again, the smaller your right thalamus becomes. You can roll up your thalamus if you don't remember your A&P class from a few years ago, or maybe longer, depending on, like me. I think I took A&P back in like 91. But the role of thalamus is to relay motor and sensory signals to the cortex, so clearly a very important role. In this case, the age of first exposure was actually twice as strong of a predictor as duration play was. Corpus callosum, similar concept here. What they found, duration of career, pretty long in both cases, 18 and 20 years. Same group, same concussion assessment technique, and now we see far, far lower numbers, still pretty high numbers, 40 and 45, but a long ways from that 370 and 390 we saw a couple slides ago. And they use the same modern definition of concussion right there. And what they found here was that on fMRI, I'm sorry, on DTI, I'm sorry, fMRI, sorry, let me correct myself. Those who started playing football before the age of 12 did worse. And so what you're looking for here is your FA value or fractional anisotropy. You want to be higher. And here, in this case, you see the below 12 is lower in both these groups. And you want radiodiffusivity to be lower. And again, you see here, it's what's worse in the groups that's below 12. But they assessed 36 different things and found significance in 4. Well, it's 4 parts of the brain, 4 brain connections. We don't want that to occur, but it is only 4 of 36 assessments. So not good in that regard, but also not overwhelming either. Brain volume in competitive fighters. So again, people, now in this case, they get hit in the head for a living. In active fighters, we saw definitely decreases in both active and retired fighters. Cognitive outcomes. And so you ask the question now, okay, so we see these changes on MRI. One of the real questions that's come out of some of these MRI studies is, okay, there's a slight FA difference here. There's a little bit of radiodiffusivity difference there. Does this matter in real life? Do we actually see these differences? Or is this like the analysis, the analogy we oftentimes hear, 80% of people have a herniated disc on MRI and are asymptomatic. In that case, do we care about it? Do we care that we see these small, usually small differences in MRI? And, here it kind of matches up, I don't want to say nicely, but kind of nicely, where the people where there are some differences on MRI, and we also see, especially in retired fighters here, that there's motor issues, motor impairments, depression, and cognitive deficits as well. It's never, I didn't phrase that great. It's never nice to have cognitive deficits, but it's nice that matches up where we see some of this, impulsivity and amygdala. That's going, that's emotion regulation. And so if we have impaired amygdala on neuroimaging, it's probably not surprising we have changes in impulsivity as well. But again, these were fighters, not football players. Behavioral outcomes. Once again, we see it back to football here. Seasons of play, age of first exposure, about 9 years old to 13 years old. Total number of concussions coming down again. Once again, using the same sample, the same technique that was used previously. But now we went from 392 down to 17 concussions, or 15 and 25 in these groups right here. And what they found was that those who started playing first, young below the age of 12, did worse. This is behavioral dysregulation and executive dysfunction. If you're over about 65, you're worse on these. You see again, under the age of 12 is worse in both of them. We see depressive scores right here. Again, higher is worse. So once again, it's below 12, definitely doing worse in this regard. And then on apathy, once again, the below age 12 is doing worse. So, we're seeing the neuroimaging and we're seeing outcomes, psychological and neurocognitive outcomes that are all suggesting that they are doing worse right here. So this study here, this just came out about June 26th, about a month ago. And so it goes beyond football and sports and looks at a large number of individuals with TBI across the board. So this is not just mild TBI, but TBI across the board. Repetitive head impacts, both sports and abuse. Domestic abuse as it relates to TBI is sadly very understudied, also sadly needed. Kerry Espinoza down at Rutgers is doing some really nice work on that. I think that's an area that needs further study. Combination or neither. And this is just one particular graph I pulled out of this, but this is a depression scale where those who are negative for repetitive head impact and TBI did the best down here. And as you work your way across, I cherry picked this one. This is the best looking one, where you see a pretty steady increase up to this purple one, which is positive repetitive head impacts, positive TBI, and a loss of consciousness TBI had the highest depression. So again, it gives us this general consensus that getting hit in the head repeatedly probably isn't great for us.
Hey, Tom, we have a question in the chat real quick.
Sure. Yep.
Sarah wants to know, was the age of 12 in these studies chosen likely due to puberty or specific to football-related age brackets for organized teams?
It is generally chosen because this is a peak period of myelination of the axon in the brain. And so we all develop differently. But between 10 and 14, really 12 probably being the average for this, is when we see kind of this peak myelination occurring. And so the theory is that if you suffer repetitive head impacts and brain trauma prior to the age of 12, prior to the axon being myelinated, it may not myelinate. It's going to affect overall neurological development. And so that's kind of where that comes from. Again, there's some discussion because there's a male-female difference potentially. And again, there's a bit of a range between like 10 and 14, 11 and 13. But it is neurophysiological and not from football age bracketing.
Thank you.
And so, yep, yeah, and please feel free to jump in other questions here. I'll either answer them or make something up. Just kidding. So we look at the idea here of CTE. So this is the one we had all discussion about, right? It's all the news everywhere you go. Really the elephant in the room is, does playing football younger, does starting football younger result in an increased rate or increased risk of developing CTE? I'm not an Alabama. I have a friend of mine who's a big Alabama fan, so I make fun of this one right here. It's the elephant in the room. That's the question: is are we predisposing these kids to CTE by starting young? The answer appears to be no, which is a relatively encouraging answer. I'd like to point out that this study I'm going to run through right here for the next couple minutes is also from the same BU group. So, we have sadly, we have an argument of deniers that if you don't support CTE being, I don't want to go too far on a tangent here, but sadly, this has been politicized to the point of either you are all in or all out on this, as opposed to some middle ground. But the quote unquote all in group, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way because they've done some great work and continue to do some great work. But this is the same group. So this is not like this is this is like some NFL funded study that says this. So this is age of first exposure, tackle football and CTE. These people develop CTE. You see across the x-axis here, they're spread across their age for exposure, even up to age 20. So that's a pretty late age for exposure setting up there. And so their age 12 drops in right there. And you see it's roughly evenly split. The mean's 11.84, which again, right about 12. And the median is 12. And so in this one, this is the same group right here, the characteristics. And concussion history was not provided in this study, which was very interesting, as they said they had it in the data, in the methods. Years of football play, CTE people played longer than no CTE people. What's interesting is the CTE positive group actually started playing a little bit later than the CTE negative group, which is, is 0.58 years a meaningful difference? Probably not. It does reach statistical significance over here for the interaction overall, but there's a small difference right there. And so what you see in this graph is these are people who had problems. Okay, so the one question is, does earlier age of first exposure cause CTE or associate with CTE? And second one is, in those people with CTE, did age of first exposure mitigate things? You see the cognitive onset starts younger, the younger you start playing. So this line slopes up. The later you start playing football, if you were going to have onset, if you're going to have symptoms, they start later. Important to point out, this graph does not say you're going to have symptoms. It is if you have symptoms, they will start later, the later you start playing. And same idea over here on behavioral mood symptoms. The later you start playing football, the later this onset will be. And again, once again, this is not saying you will have them, it's if you do have them. Couple big take-home quotes right here. Again, from the study, relationship between AFE, either continuous or dichotomous age 12, and CTE severity was not significant in the study. That's a really big finding. That says that the age at which you started playing football was not significantly associated with the severity of CTE. Now, it's important to note, this does not say your risk of CTE, because we don't have a CTE negative group in there. All right. It's also associated any number. It was not associated, excuse me, with a number of other brain pathologies for Lewy bodies, Alzheimer's, some other issues there as well. So that kind of takes us through what's happening in later life in people with earlier age of first exposure. It kind of brings the focus here. What the real question to me is football, and I put football in quotes because football can also refer to soccer, right? Safe. And so where are the numbers? Where are the kids? Well, the athletic trainers, I presume most of the audience right here, you know the vast majority of the kids are playing high school and youth football, and your chances of going from high school to college are relatively slim. And from NCAA to pro is extraordinarily slim as well. So 98% of the people playing football in the U.S. are high school and below. All right, so this is the question that kind of comes up. I'm going to start at kind of top of the pyramid, the NFL guys. And so this one came out a few years back looking at death. Do you die younger, or are you more likely to die if you played football? And the answer was no. For sex-specific and age-specific, you see there's actually a reduced rate here. It's called standardized mortality rate. If a 1.0 would be normal. Any below 1 is you are less likely. Any above 1, you are more likely. We'll see that next couple of slides here. And so we see a lower likelihood of dying, lower likelihood of cancer, heart disease, suicide, and assault. Really important when you look at these mortality type studies that they're controlled for age and sex. Men die younger than women. Men die more violent deaths than women. And as you age, obviously things like cancer and heart disease risk go up. Similar one, this looks at neurodegenerative specifically. And so cause of death overall, again, that rate is a lot lower. Cancer is lower, cardiovascular is lower, but neurodegenerative is higher. So you are less likely to die from cancer, cardiovascular disease, injuries, violence, or other causes. But you are more likely when you die to have a neurological disease, particularly ALS is the one that really jumps quite high right here. These are relatively small numbers, so it's hard to draw much conclusion on 2 people with Parkinson's. There was a study just about a day or 2 ago. There were some methodological problems with it that did suggest concussion was associated with Parkinson's. It was done up in Winnipeg, Canada, actually. But this one here is a relatively large number. Parkinson's was not actually, because it crosses the 1 line there. So you kind of just, and it's been a big study that came out in soccer last summer. Last fall, I forget which, it all seemed like a long time ago now. Found a very similar thing that in soccer players, you're less likely to die, but you're more likely to die of neurodegenerative disease. So taking a step back to high school, what about playing high school football? All right, so this is people who played football in the 40s and 50s, 46 to 56. They compared football players to non-football band, glee club, and choir. As before the TV show Glee came out. And what they found here was that there was really no difference in developing dementia, Parkinson's, or ALS between these 2 groups. Similar here versus general population, what you should expect. There was no difference. This one here, there was an elevated risk of Parkinson's in both football players and band and glee club members. Not quite sure what the underlying neuropathology that is. And ALS was not elevated either. This one came out of Wisconsin, looking at a large number of kids right here, 296 football players, 190 non-football. And again, very similar finding here. We see that no elevated risk of dementia, no elevated risk of Parkinson's. There was an elevated risk of head trauma amongst the football players, which probably isn't surprising versus non-football players. There were no ALS cases, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or Lou Gehrig's disease, neither group, so you can't compare it. But dementia and Parkinson's were not elevated. And looking at some of the cognitive outcomes here, so modified CSD, this is a depression scale. And what you actually found was that football players had slightly fewer depressive symptoms than controls did. So they were 10,000 Wisconsin high school graduates in 1957. One of the challenges to this research is we want to see what the effect of playing football today is later on. But if you're 15 years old or 20 years old today, we can't make you 60 years old tomorrow. Some of us may feel like that happened already, but it actually takes 40, 50 years for that to occur. You have to go back 50 years to find these people and what's going on. That raises the obvious question about the game of football today is obviously quite different than it was in 1957. And what does this lead to? A lot of you, I saw a lot of Massachusetts email addresses on the list. There's discussion on Massachusetts banning youth football, New York, New Jersey, Maryland. So this really brings us to a larger public health discussion. Now, I think it's ironic that this is actually put out by a law firm. And we have this discussion, USA Today, Kristen Witzke at BU, about banning youth football. We are seeing some change where flag football rates are going up and tackle football rates are going down. In Delaware, where I am, we had an op-ed piece in our major state newspaper. We only have one of them because we're a small state. And he argues that we should cancel sports because what's been widely reported in the media. So who is this guy? Delaware must suspend public support for tackle football. He's a UD professor, one of my colleagues. I've never met him because he works in management information systems where he does research on things like this, trust and distrust in online banking. But he nevertheless has a large opinion piece, about 500 words, in our student state newspaper calling for the elimination of high school football. We responded, a group of us did. That's one of the physicians I work with. And this kind of debate goes on. So this next little bit I'm going to jump through right here is what happens when you're young. So you start playing football when you're young. You start at an early age of first exposure to collision sports. But you're only 20 years old. First of all, why does this matter? We know academic performance and success in high school and college goes a long ways in predicting life outcomes. Most of you have seen the statistics that if you have a college degree, you earn more money over the course of your life. Obviously, they weren't talking to athletic trainers, right? But if you have a graduate degree, you earn even more than people with high school degrees only. And so if we see neurocognitive deficits when you're in high school or college, is this going to affect you across the course of your entire life? This work mostly comes out of the care program that we have to be part of right here. There's 30 schools nationwide. You may have seen some of the work on this. If you haven't, this is the website I would encourage you to take a look at. There's some of the largest concussion studies you'll ever see coming out of this database right here. I'm going to share a couple with you now. This is the overview of care. And this data from what's called the clinical arm, where we do a wide array of testing on student athletes. There also is an arm that does head impacts, MRIs, blood biomarkers, and genetics, and they're well outside of today's discussion. So, the age of football before the age of 12 was not associated with cognitive deficits and concussion, 4,000 people. My colleague Jacqueline Cassis, who's out of Ohio State, this stuff comes from her, which is why it's this annoying scarlet and gray from Ohio State College, right? Verbal memory, visual motor speed, reaction time were not different amongst these groups. And where there are some small differences, they're not meaningful at all. This obviously comes from impact. One place we do see a difference was people who played football. So again, these are current college students, 18 to 20 years old, at the schools you saw on those slides a couple slides ago, which are largely state flagship institutions, Princeton, Penn from the Ivy. But the people who did start playing football younger had about half a symptom less than those who didn't, which probably isn't really all that meaningful, but it's interesting that's the direction it's in. Similar concept, looking at cadets. Obviously, a very important group of people who are going to go on to be officers in the service in the U.S. military. And the results are pretty much identical. In this case, there's no differences down here. We see a little bit of variability, but the group played non-contact sports actually had the highest symptoms, but again, no real difference. I want to step back here. I should mention here, we know playing sports is good for your health overall. And so the question becomes in part, is football, wrestling, lacrosse, ice hockey, these sports you hit in the head regularly, still good, or would you be better off if you played tennis, ran cross country, etc.? And so the control groups in these studies are not non-athletes. They are non-contact athletes in the same university. So it's not, we're not comparing kids at Princeton to kids at Southwest Nowhere State. This is Princeton versus Princeton, Penn versus Penn, etc. Just looking at kids playing collision contact sports and non-contact. Again, this is largely rowing, track, tennis, golf, things along those lines. You hit and head competitively in golf, there's a whole different conversation going on. You're probably playing near me, in which case I apologize. But again, no difference is seen across the board here. Those are some basic neurocognitive testing, but obviously neurological functions a lot broader than that. And there's a lot of other things we bring to the table. And so we look at just the age of first exposure to sports, we're ignoring sex factors, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, neurodevelopmental, mental health, migraine, headache. There's a lot that you bring to the table that shows up in these neurological outcomes. And so we're saying, okay, when you come into college, what sports, age, sport bias, concussion, neurodevelopmental, that's ADHD, learning disabilities, migraine, socioeconomics, race, ethnicity. And the way these next couple of graphs will work is if it's green, they did better. If it's red, the group did worse. And so this is BSI 18. If you're not familiar with it, it's a self-report survey on quality on depression, anxiety. I'm presuming everyone here is familiar with impact, post-concussion syndrome symptoms, and the best. And what we found here, for the most part, is those who were in contact sports or started earlier actually did better on most of these measures. But while they did do better, they're not really all that meaningful. Look at this graph right here. It's kind of a pain to look at, so I want you to orientate yourself. The red line are the contact sport. The gray line is a non-contact. Down here is when you started playing. So age 4 is the youngest for these sports. And so the earlier you started, you were slightly higher, and this is verbal memory, on impact than if you started later. But we're talking about a score here that's going to range from about 84 on verbal memory down about 81 or 82. Reliable change index there is about 10. So yes, it's different. Yes, contact sports did better. Yes, earlier contact sports did better, but really not in a meaningful manner. Same idea here, visual memory. You start to see a little more separation here where, again, those who started early did a little better than those who started later. This is for men, so that was women, this is men, over 4,000 in this study. And again, we see a very similar concept. Those who played football did a little better on a lot of these things. Earlier exposure did a little better. But once again, what we're seeing, this is BSI depression. We're seeing almost no difference at all. I mean, these two lines down here, there's actually, you look at this piece over here, there's actually two lines there, you can't see them. These are significant because there's 4,000 people, not because there's a big difference. Same thing here. They're significant where earlier exposure was better, football was better, but not in any meaningful manner. And this is symptoms, once again, not really in any meaningful manner. There's some outliers up here, right? I mean, the kid who walks in and tells you they have a 58 on a baseline Grayson checklist. Either they're massively hungover because they had the Kenny Chesney concert yesterday, they have the flu, or something else is going on, right? So effect of age of first exposure on concussion outcomes. So if you started playing younger and you did suffer some damage from playing younger, one thought process is that you're able to compensate when you're still 20 years old because you have enough compensatory strategies, enough ways to learn, enough ways to test, that maybe we're not seeing anything because we have compensatory strategies. And so we ask the question, if following concussion, these compensatory strategies are probably reduced. And we found, again, largely no difference. This paper it's been accepted. It will be out. It's been a slow process. Hopefully, by Labor Day, this should be in print in Neurology. You'll see it. And what we found here was that earlier age of first exposure had this is post-concussion. This is acutely post-concussion. They were slightly worse on impact visual motor speed, and they started playing later. So maybe there's some compensatory, but we do see a couple of folks with some big drops over there really driving a lot of this. And conversely, BSI 18, earlier age of first exposure, did better on these somatization scores. In both cases, not particularly big differences. And again, across a wide array of tests, these are the only two, across all these different measures right here, across a number of different time points, only two were significant, and they were pretty small effects, so not much going on there. The results, the effect size, were very, very small in these. Some work done as a wrap up here from non-care data, looking at both high school and college athletes. We have very little information right now on age of first exposure in high school athletes. Dr. Howell needs to do that work for us. And what they found, again, about 18-year-olds, so it's a mix of high school and college. And across a lot of these tests you guys are all familiar with, SCAT symptoms, SAC, BEST, IMPACT, BSI. This is trail making, King-Devick, disability, behaviors, a number of different scores here, ACT score. We found two things. They found two things. I'm not part of the study. They found two things that were different. Those that started football before the age of 12 did a little better on visual memory, and they did a little better on BSI scores. Lower's better here. But again, these are really small differences. You really shouldn't interpret much. The difference here is about 2 with a standard deviation of 13. So really small differences. And so rather than trying to make an argument that early age first exposure is good, the discussion here is that when young, early age first exposure is probably not bad. So what can we do to try and help some of this? Well, how about we stop doing this, right? So, head impacts are not intuitive, are part of, you're not going to play football or hockey or wrestling without head impacts. They're going to occur. But, there's, if we stop the unintentional one here, this is kind of a 23, McCullough, just got 6 head impacts that are probably relatively decent G-forces. For really no apparent reason. Interesting, I was actually trying to refine this video, trying to get a clearer one. He was actually penalized twice for targeting as well while playing at Texas. So take what you want from that. So conclusion, what's the relationship between age of first exposure, duration of play, exposure, impact, kinematics? We talk about age of first exposure, but if you start playing football young and you're a bench warmer, we don't really know what's going to happen on that. Right now, Pop Warner Football and USA Football have changed their rules to reduce head impacts. We don't know the effects of that. We really don't know the duration of play issue. Is 10 years duration from 5 to 15 better or worse than 15 and 25? The exposure to positions you play, does a person play both sides of the ball versus one side of the ball? For those of you who've worked youth football, playing both sides of the ball, playing, offensive line and defensive line is not terribly uncommon, especially in smaller towns. Playing running back and safety. Impact kinematics, almost none of these take into account the accelerations experienced during the impacts. Is it worse to take a small number of really big impacts, aka your wide receiver, your quarterback, or is the offensive lineman getting hit over and over and over again worse at lower thresholds? Right now, some of the stuff seems to suggest that the linemen do a little worse, but there's a lot that's not known about that. Earlier age of first exposure is associated with worse outcomes in older adults in most studies, not all. Keeping in mind that many of these studies, the inclusion criteria is you have neurocognitive or psychological problems. And so, again, as I mentioned with one slide, the generalizability to this is somewhat limited. And it's pretty good evidence right now that when you're young, it's not a problem. So That's not to say that when you're 20, that if you may have problems later in life, they just not show up when you're 20. We don't know, and we're not going to sit here and say that it's definitely the case. I can just tell you right now that when we're looking across very large samples of kids who are 20 years old, and we've looked at this many ways in samples of 4, 5, 6, 10,000 people, and there's just really nothing there. And when you do find something significant, it's the meaningfulness of that outcome is extremely small. But again, we want to caution that's not something that we should extrapolate and say, hey, we're going to be fine. It's just that as of right now, we're not seeing any substantial problems when they're 20. So this is our research team. I'm the one here sitting on a computer talking to you to a black screen from what I can see on the screen. But these are the folks who do most of the work, right? These are the grad students, the doctoral students that have done a lot of the work. This is actually our team over in Edinburgh, Scotland last year. So there are a lot of really great benefits being a doctoral student, but the education up to Scotland is one of them. The master students, they're all clinical outfit trainers now, and some wonderful undergraduates we've had come through the lab over the years who have really done the lion's share of the work on this. And again, I need to point out Jacqueline Cassis, that age of first exposure in younger athletes work. That's I'm the senior author, but she's done the work. She deserves the credit. That's Jacqueline right there, right now. She's at Ohio State. And there's more forthcoming on that. And the hint I'll give you is it continues to show a lot of the same. So that's it for me. That's the Concussion UD Twitter account. I don't get in Twitter wars with people. I just post studies and have some fun commentary once in a while. I will take questions now. It looks like I have about 7 or 8 minutes I have left. You are certainly welcome to email me any follow-up questions as well. I'll be happy to do that. And with that, I'm going to exit my screen and come back to see if anyone's still awake or not. Apparently, at least a couple people are, so that's encouraging.
Thank you so much, Dr. Buckley. Does anybody have any questions?
I have one. Chris Morrow, Tower Hill School, Wilmington, Delaware, Blue Hen graduate from the Delaware program. Yeah. Earlier, Sarah had a question about the age that was chosen for the study. She said 12 years old. And your comment was because they are not the myelination process. Can you go more into the physiological part about what you mean with the myelination?
Sure. So an axon, the axon is the piece that connects brain structures from one to another, and so it's what the nerve signal travels down from point A to point B. And so if you think about it, we like to describe it as a wire that's insulated. And so you have the actual wire that runs from A to B, and the insulation is the cabling that covers it. And so when you're born and when you're a kid, that myelination is very, very incomplete. And so the course of the first 10 to 15 years of your life, that the insulation on the wire, the myelination is developed. And then by time, again, around the age of 12, give or take, is when that seems to really kind of be, okay, now the axon is fully protected. And so the concern is that when the axon is not fully myelinated, if it's damaged, it might not myelinate correctly, or it could be damaged because the myelination is not there protected.
Okay, makes total sense. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I think we can take a couple of minute break for people to use the bathroom or refill their waters or whatever you got to do. And then we'll rejoin in a few minutes and get started with Dr. Howell. Thank you again, Dr. Buckley.
Good to see you, David.